Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Craig Kiger with Minnesota DNR Outreach, and today we're talking with a good friend of mine, Lindsey Shartell. She is the regional um, wildlife manager for up in Region 2, the northeast region of the state. And we're going to talk woodcock hunting and woodcock, maybe a little bit of research too. So Lindsey, tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. I started hunting about 10 years ago after I started working for Minnesota DNR. And I've got 3 dogs. Murray, he's a 10-year-old Labradoodle. Cooper, he's almost 5 years old, a German short-haired pointer. And then Durden, a 2-year-old GSP. And we spend a ton of our time in the fall chasing upland birds all across Minnesota and also in some of the other Midwest states. So it's a passion of ours and something we really enjoy doing. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about American woodcock, which is a species that's pretty special to me. I've started off my career in the DNR working for our wildlife research unit, and woodcock was one species that I was able to do research on and really enjoy working with them. So we'll jump into the presentation. Today, we will be discussing everything you need to know to successfully hunt for woodcock. I'm going to cover their biology and behavior, habitat and diet, hunting basics, how dogs can help in hunting for woodcock, where to hunt in Minnesota. We'll touch on conservation and management and a little bit on research in the woodcock banding program. The American woodcock is a relatively small migratory game bird. They're about 10 to 12 inches long, and adults weigh only 6 to 8 ounces. Some of their distinct features are their long, slender bill, their large eyes, which are positioned in the back of their head and allows them to see nearly a full circle around them, and their cryptic and camouflaged coloring, which allows them to blend in with the forest floor. Some of the other nicknames for woodcock include the timberdoodle, mud bat, Labrador twister, night partridge, and bog sucker. My personal favorite is simply to call them doodles or dudes short. One similar species that you may encounter is the snipe. They can also be hunted in Minnesota, and their season opened up September 1st. Woodcock are more of a brown and cinnamon color compared to the black and white snipe. Woodcock have fat, dark bars on the top of their head, while snipe have more narrow stripes. The woodcock's slightly larger in size, and they have shorter legs compared to the snipe, which has longer legs, and their bill will also appear longer. Woodcock are typically found in the forest and brushlands, while snipe are more of a wetland species. If you do encounter them in the woods, it'll likely be associated with standing water, and it's not uncommon to run into a few here and there. Woodcock can be found across the eastern part of North America. Most populations breed in the north and migrate south for the winter to the Gulf states. Some of the southern populations stay year-round. In Minnesota, they can be found across the state, but their primary range is in the northern forests where most of the habitat is found. Woodcock migration is an interesting topic that we're learning more about with the use of tracking devices like satellite and cell phone tracking. Understanding migration can be important to timing the best hunting of woodcock in Minnesota. Northern populations migrate following the eastern and central flyways, and most of our Minnesota birds head down to Louisiana for the winter. They migrate at night, singly or in small flocks. The spring migration occurs from March to May, and the fall migration from October to December. Often birds in Minnesota make pre-migratory moves during September. The migration is primarily driven by the weather, but is also thought to be influenced by moon phases. Woodcock are known for their unique spring mating ritual. The males can be heard peanting, which is a short, nasal, buzzy call that can sound like an insect. They peant on the ground and then perform an aerial display with sounds that they're producing by vocalizations and wing beats during a spiraling, descending flight. The sounds are often called twittering. Males use open lands to perform this sky dance at dusk. So if you're in an area with woodcock, you'll likely hear their calls and witness their sky dance starting in April and lasting through May. Woodcock reproduction is also pretty interesting. They're a ground nesting bird and they use their camouflage to hide in the leaf litter. They're some of our earliest nesters in Minnesota, taking advantage of the drab brown colors of spring to blend in. Incubation takes about 20 to 22 days, and the nests normally have 4 eggs. If a woodcock loses their nest, they'll re-nest, often having only 3 eggs. The hatch in Minnesota typically peaks in mid-May, but can depend on the weather. Woodcock chicks leave the nest immediately with their mother, and they can fly after only 2 weeks. They become independent in 6 to 8 weeks. An important topic to cover when you want to be successful hunting any species of wildlife is habitat. Habitat is the shelter, water, food, and space required for a species to survive and reproduce. To find birds, you really are looking for their habitat. American woodcock habitat is early successional, so young forests and brushlands. This overlaps quite a bit with the habitat preferences for ruffed grouse, and grouse hunters commonly target woodcock as well. Woodcock tend to like dense, even-aged, small diameter trees. For aspen, this is in the 5 to 18-year-old age range, though they can sometimes be found in younger and older forests. Woodcock also use forest openings and open landscapes for mating and for roosting at night, including old fields and lowland brush swamps. Moist or damp soil is important for feeding, and the best soils are loamy, not too sandy, and not too packed clay. So when you're walking in good woodcock habitat, the ground often feels soft under your feet as opposed to hard, dry packed soil. Here's some great examples of fall woodcock habitat. You'll see that they have in common dense young trees and a relatively open understory without a lot of grasses. This makes it easier for woodcock to walk around as they spend most of their time on the ground. You never find them perched in a tree. So look for trees that are about broomstick sized and close together. Areas with openings are also great places to find woodcock, especially these wet openings in a young aspen stand. Woodcock are often on the edges of these openings, but they can also be found within the dense forest or brush. The nice thing about openings is that they make a great opportunity to get a clear shot at a woodcock without swinging your gun through a dense forest of trees. When hunting, look for those edges and openings to target. The woodcock's diet is another important part of habitat. Woodcock are known for eating earthworms. However, worms are exotic and they were introduced from Europe and Asia. Areas with earthworms present do provide a good food source for woodcock, and it's not surprising to harvest a bird with a worm in its mouth. They also eat a variety of other invertebrates. Current research in Minnesota is looking at the diet of woodcock by collecting fecal samples. Initial findings show a variety of insects, including spiders, beetles, true bugs, flies, and butterflies and moths, which is likely their caterpillars. But earthworms were still a staple of their diet and were found in about 60% of the samples. Woodcock feed by probing the soil with their bill. The flexible bill tip is used to capture prey. At times, birds walk slowly and rock back and forth, stepping heavily. You have likely seen videos of the woodcock bob or woodcock dancing. This action is thought to make insects move around in the soil, increasing their detectability. It's a good tactic to keep an eye out for woodcock sign. Probe holes from feeding and footprints in moist soil are a good indication that woodcock are nearby. Woodcock splash or fecal matter is also common in areas with woodcock. It's a white splotch with dirt within it. In areas where there are many woodcock, there can be splash all over the forest floor. Wet splash is fresh and it dries up as it gets older, and so dry splash indicates that woodcock were there previously. Understanding the biology, habits, and habitats of woodcock is an important part to being successful hunting them, but we'll transition now into directly talking about some hunting basics and tactics. So the 2023 season is going to be starting up here soon on Saturday, September 23rd, and it lasts until November 6th. Our federal frameworks dictate the length of the season and the bag limits. For woodcock, a 45-day season is allowed. This does sometimes cause overlap with the deer firearm opener at the end of the woodcock season, but often the birds have migrated south by then. In Minnesota, by rule, the woodcock season always starts on the Saturday nearest to September 22nd. In some years, this coincides with the rough grouse opener, which is always on the Saturday closest to September 16th. But more commonly, it falls on the waterfowl opener like it will this year, so September 23rd. Shooting hours are half an hour before sunrise to sunset. The daily bag limit is 3 birds, and the possession limit is 9 birds. Woodcock are often hunted in conjunction with ruffed grouse. For both, a small game license is needed. Since woodcock are migratory, they also require you to have a free HIP certification, which stands for the Harvest Information Program. This federal program tracks hunter harvest and other information to make science-based decisions on season frameworks such as the dates and bag limits. So in Minnesota, there is an exception to the blaze orange rule for hunting migratory birds. However, blaze orange is required for grouse hunters as well as during firearm and muzzleloader deer seasons. So it's recommended that all woodcock hunters always wear blaze orange or pink. The birds are not affected by the colors. A hat or a shirt or vest is necessary, except during deer seasons when both a hat and a shirt or vest are required. It can also be helpful to have blaze orange on your dog, especially in areas where other hunters might be present. And in the thick cover, it's a good way to find them when they're on point. So woodcock are a great introductory species for new hunters and new bird dogs. Their habitat is common. They can be abundant during migration. They're easily identified by their long bill and distinctive twitter sound when flushing. They hold tightly for pointing dogs and often flush up before zooming out, offering a shot opportunity. This is a picture of my sister, Rachel. She had never hunted before. She had shot handguns, but never a shotgun. And she was able to use an apprentice license to hunt with me and my dog, Cooper. I lent her a gun, some shells, a pair of boots, and a blaze orange hat, and she managed to bag her first woodcock on her first day out. That brings us to hunting gear. You really don't need a lot to hunt woodcock, like with my sister there. A shotgun is necessary, and I recommend a lightweight, short-barreled shotgun, which is easier to move through the woods with. More open chokes, like cylinder, skeet, and improved cylinder, will give you a larger pattern and better odds of hitting a bird. Tighter chokes will work just fine, but will likely hit a close bird pretty hard. For shells, most target and small game loads will work. I prefer using a smaller shot for woodcock, such as 8-shot target loads, or a 7.5 shot if I'm also chasing rough grouse. Lead is allowed in most areas, except on some federal lands and in the farmland region, but non-toxic shot is a great alternative to limit the accumulation of lead in the environment. Personally, I've switched to using non-toxic and have used the Boss shot shells, which is a copper-plated bismuth in size 7 for grouse and woodcock. Eye protection is always recommended when shooting. It also protects your eyes from the branches in the thick cover. I've learned my lesson many a times, not wearing glasses in thick aspen woods and getting scratched in the eye with a branch. Good boots are important, makes walking easier. I often wear knee boots, which are nice for the wet woodcock habitats that they're found in. Blaze orange or pink clothing, as I mentioned earlier, as well as layers of clothing for any weather in the fall. A vest is handy to carry your ammo, birds, and any other gear. Make sure you bring water and a compass, map, or GPS device to help with navigation. A popular app is the Onyx Hunt app, which will show your location along with other helpful info, such as public lands and cover types. Some safety considerations when hunting. Always keep the gun pointed in a safe direction. Typically, up is always safe. Unload the gun when crossing obstacles, setting it down, or attending to other things like dogs. Only take the safety off when you're ready to shoot. Always be aware of where everyone is before shooting, including dogs. Know what's beyond your target. Don't shoot across or towards roads or trails when you don't know if someone could be coming. And avoid shooting at birds on the ground or low flushes. So hunting with dogs. My favorite way to hunt woodcock, of course, is with my dogs. They're a great bird to hunt with dogs because they hold very tight and they don't flush until they're heavily pressured. Both flushing and pointing breeds can excel at woodcock hunting. Even mixed breeds like my Labradoodle Murray here can be good woodcock dogs. And finding down birds in thick cover is also much easier if you have a dog who will locate or retrieve birds, although woodcock are known to be a bird that a lot of dogs don't want to pick up, but many will happily find them for you. Pointing dogs also provide time for a shooter to get into place and ready before flushing, which can make them great for new shooters. Some good tips for hunting with your dog are to walk trails and to let your dog do the work in the woods, on either side searching for birds. Woodcock will often flush over the trail from the dense cover, giving you room to shoot. Pay attention to where your dog is and their behavior. This is especially important for flushing dogs. My Labradoodle Murray, his tail swings in a big circle when he's on bird scent and about to flush a bird up. For pointing dogs, try to approach points by circling around the dog and coming in head on or from the side. Be careful not to shoot over dogs as they may jump unexpectedly. Most importantly is to trust your dog. Woodcock often opt to stay still and rely on their camo to hide, so if your dog is getting birdie, keep kicking around and looking for that bird, especially if you notice some of that woodcock splash on the ground. In addition to your gear, there's also plenty of dog gear that can help you in hunting woodcock. Traditionally, bells were used since the cover is so thick that you can't see your dog most of the time. They're still very common and it's a good inexpensive way to keep track of the dog as long as you can find them when they go on point. Today, beeper collars, GPS tracking devices, and syncable watches are all available. I use a Garmin Alpha on my dogs as well as a beeper when they're on point. You should always have a collar on your dog with your contact info and a leash in case they need to be restrained. Water's important, especially early season, and a small first aid kit can be useful for both humans and dogs, especially if you end up having to pull some porcupine quills. The woodcock migration in the spring also offers a good opportunity for spring training of dogs. As they say, wild birds make wild bird dogs, so it's good to get dogs out there early. Training is allowed during early spring and late summer, but you may not train dogs on wild birds from April 16th to July 14th, and that's to protect nesting and young wildlife. While training, you can carry a firearm, but only have blank cartridges or shells in possession when the season is not open. This is also a great time to scout for habitat and places to hunt in the fall. So where to hunt woodcock? There are more than 11 million acres of public lands to hunt in Minnesota. We have state lands, county, the county tax forfeit, federal and industrial timberlands, such as Blandon. Talk about a few resources that can get you started, including our hunter walking trails, our wildlife management areas, rough grouse management areas, and the Minnesota DNR Recreation Compass. Hunter walking trails provide easy access to wildlife habitat managed for species like game birds. These areas typically have forests in a variety of age classes that provide habitat components for woodcock and grouse. The trailheads have good off-road parking and they're easy to find. The trails are gated to prevent motorized access in most cases. And their trails are also mowed for easy walking and they give you something to follow. Information on hunter walking trails and maps for these sites can be found on our DNR website. If you go to the website, just search HWT and you'll find a list of all the trails and where they are. Wildlife management areas are another great place to hunt for woodcock. They're state lands managed for wildlife habitat. Most are open to hunting and a lot of them do have hunter walking trails. The website will list cover types and game species present in each WMA by county, so it's a great tool to easily see where you can find upland game birds. They're found throughout the state in forests, grasslands, and wetlands. And for woodcock, focusing on those forests and brushland WMAs will offer the most success, but they can be found just about anywhere. Since woodcock are often hunted along with rough grouse, it makes sense that rough grouse management areas would make a great place to hunt woodcock as well. These forests are managed for both rough grouse and woodcock habitat by ensuring that there's a good mix of age classes. They often entail small block management that creates lots of edge habitat and diversity. They have trailheads with parking areas that offer easy access. There's over 100,000 acres of rough grouse management area land at 49 locations with 184 miles of hunter walking trails. Again, tons of info and maps are available on the DNR website for these locations. They're great places to get started. Another tool that I use is the Minnesota DNR Recreation Compass. It's a great source to find state lands to hunt. It also can show aerial imagery. It shows ownership, trails, and other data that helps you find recreation opportunities. When you click on an area, you can link to a specific hunter walking trail, WMA, or state forest web page, and that's what I typically use it for the most. Little trick that I use is I use the Recreation Compass to link to a state forest maps. These maps for the state forests are super detailed and they will show you which roads you're allowed to drive on to access lands, as well as which roads or trails that you're seeing on aerial imagery might be limited to ATVs or snowmobiles, and what other kinds of restrictions there are for access to the lands. For example, we've got this area with limitations in Land O'Lakes State Forest here, where motorized vehicles are not allowed. And they've got some nice hunter walking trails in there. They also show other county lands as well in the yellow-brown color on this map, and recreation facilities like campsites, ski trails, boat launches. They're really a great resource. So mapping and e-scouting is also a good way to find woodcock habitat on other state and public lands before you get out in the woods. Google Maps, Google Earth, and many other apps are a great place to find hunting locations using aerial imagery. Onyx has become really popular lately, and that shows land ownership data as well as your location on your phone. They've added a forest disturbance layer that is created by the Minnesota DNR that can help hunters find early successional habitat. They've also got some cover type information in there as well. The DNR also offers our state forest inventory data from state lands available from the MinGeo website that you can download and use in some of the more advanced mapping apps. For woodcock, what I'm looking for is recent harvest with young, dense trees, those 5 to 18-year-old stands. These areas will show up more uniform across the stand without individual tree canopies visible. The younger stands tend to look lighter or brighter and more yellow-green in color. In this photo here, the stand in the north is a 6-year-old aspen stand, and this stand in the south is a 11-year-old aspen stand. So you can see kind of the color difference there, but looks more like a younger forest. In the younger stand, you can see the individual older trees that were left as reserves during this harvest. You'll also be able to see trails that you could follow, openings and edges to check out, and these wetlands where you know this is going to be a nice wet edge for woodcock. Here's another example of an area that's managed with small block management. You can see these little squares of harvest throughout this site. We've also got a hunter walking trail. This is a clip from Onyx. And you can see that the younger, lighter colored blocks are the younger forest. These darker areas are older and they even appear taller. There are also forest openings visible kind of at the end of these trails. And by looking at an area like this where you know that there's good habitat, you can start to get a feel for what a good aspen stand looks like, what differences in age look like, and you can apply that to other areas. So when to hunt? Timing the migration of woodcock is a puzzle each year. We always try to do it because it can lead to some great hunting opportunities as birds from Canada come down into Minnesota and stack up in suitable habitat to feed and rest before continuing their trip south. Local birds also move around and group up in stands before migration in September, so you can get into large groups of birds. Those big groups of birds are referred to as woodcock flights. So you might hear a woodcock hunter say that the flights are in, which means those groups of birds from Canada have made it down to Minnesota and are starting to pile up. Rivers often make good corridors for woodcock migration, and there can be some really great hunting in close proximity to the metro as the birds are migrating through. Timing migration can be tricky. It differs every year. It usually peaks in northern Minnesota in mid-October. Watch the weather north of you. Note changes in conditions such as cold fronts and storms, early snowfalls, freezing temperatures, and southerly winds that woodcock can take advantage of to get a ride south. The fun part of woodcock hunting is that they can be packed in a stand one day and completely gone the next. Once you've harvested your woodcock, you're probably wondering how to cook them. They don't have the best reputation, but they can be excellent if cooked right. There's a lot of different ways to cook them. They can be roasted whole or breasted out. The main trick is to avoid overcooking. They should be pink in the middle and can be cooked to a medium rare. The breasts are dark meat, shown here next to some rough grouse, while the thighs of the woodcock are a white meat. The legs make a good handle for a nice bite of a buffalo woodcock thigh, but of course, the go-to is usually a bacon-wrapped woodcock jalapeno popper, and so that's always an option. So before we wrap up, I want to touch briefly on some conservation and management. Woodcock are declining across their range in both the eastern and central regions. We track males by conducting singing ground surveys in the spring, counting painting birds, and those numbers have been declining slowly over time. Hunter harvested birds are also aged in sex at the woodcock wing bee each year to calculate an index of young per adult female, and those numbers have also been below the long-term average more recently. Population decline is thought to be linked to habitat loss, but is likely much more complex than that. Some of the habitat management that we do for woodcock here in the DNR includes our timber harvest to create early successional or young forest habitat. As part of this, we can plan for diverse age classes through time so that young forest is always available in an area. We use brushland shearing to rejuvenate stagnant brush and create new growth. We also maintain forest wildlife openings to provide singing and roosting grounds for woodcock. We did some research on our forest openings here, looking at vegetation within them, and found that a good portion of our openings were occupied by woodcock. So they definitely are using these sites. The openings also benefit a wide variety of other wildlife species like deer, and in general, promoting plant diversity, whether it's forbs, shrubs, fruiting plants, and trees, will benefit woodcock by allowing for diverse insect populations, which serve as their food, and also as food for many of our other game birds and wildlife species. Finally, I have to mention the volunteer woodcock banding program, which I'm a part of. Volunteers with their pointing dogs that are steady to flushing birds can become certified to band woodcock as part of a program led by Woodcock Minnesota Conservation Organization. The dogs are used to locate hen woodcock with their chicks in the spring, and the chicks are captured and banded to collect information on harvest, migration, and for other research efforts like the diet study I was talking about earlier. We were collecting fecal samples from the hen and chick this spring for that study. Plus they're pretty cute little chicks with huge feet. So that is all I have for today. There's a ton of information, like I mentioned, on the Minnesota DNR website. You can learn more about woodcock and grouse hunting, and also check out that recreation compass to find places to hunt near you. And we have plenty of time for questions today, so I'd be happy to take some from the group. Thank you.
Wonderful job, Lindsey. We'll leave your title slide up there just for a little bit so they can write down your email address if they're looking for that. And you talked about using 7.5 or 8 lead shot, 7-shot for steel, but did you talk about your favorite gauge for hunting woodcock?
No, I did not mention that. So I personally like shooting 20 gauge, but any gauge will do. 12 gauge gets to be a little heavy to carry around the woods, and I've been eyeing up a 28 gauge myself to get even lighter. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, anything from 410 to 12 gauge would work just fine for woodcock. They're a pretty easy bird to knock down.
Okay. Um, do you like over under or side by side
I
for
have
being
gone
open?
the route of side by side now. I was an over under for a while, and I have a now custom built side by side fitted to my dimensions, which for a woman hunting, that makes a huge difference. Getting a gun fitted to you and it shoots where I point it. And yeah, I love that new side by side.
Lindsay and I have had the opportunity to hunt pheasants one time, and I know she was shooting her 20 gauge over under and doing quite well with that. And then I do know that she'd got that 28 gauge side by side. Was it 28?
20. Still
20.
stuck with the 20 gauge, but
You know, and so yeah, it just makes a nice carry gun out in the field, and 2 shots tend to be plenty for woodcock or grouse hunting. You don't need to stuff a magazine full of 5 shells and hope that you're gonna get to shoot all 5 shots. Um, we've got a couple questions that have rolled in. Um, any tips or guides on how to clean the birds?
yeah, so I tend to do a lot of breasting out of my woodcock. And so the easy way to do it really is to just peel the skin back off the breast, leave the bird whole, and get in there, get the breast exposed, and cut right straight down the keel on one side, and just kind of flip it out, and then you do the same on the other side, and you've got a nice little chunk of meat there. I know a lot of people do try to pluck and roast their woodcock whole, which is another way it can be done. A little more time consuming there, but I've heard it's worth the effort.
So I've heard the flavor of woodcock described a little livery. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's fair. It definitely has more of a gamey flavor, being a darker color.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, the trick is really just not to overcook it at all. It can be a
Right.
little weird cooking a bird medium rare, but for these game birds, we're not concerned about a lot of the things we would be with chicken, and it's perfectly safe and pretty delicious.
You got me thinking about different things, and I do a lot of venison poppers, and I wonder how a woodcock popper would be with a little cheese and maybe a peppercini pepper. I'm not big enough to try jalapenos yet, so.
No, they're definitely delicious. I do make a lot of woodcock poppers. They're a great appetizer. One of my favorite peppers actually is to get a poblano, and they're bigger. They'll fit a breast in each half of it pretty well.
Oh,
And they're not
very
quite as
nice.
spicy, but they've got a different flavor that goes really well.
Good. Jim wants to know if woodcock tend to run on the ground if wounded like pheasants do.
So woodcock, so before shooting, woodcock typically hold pretty tight, but there is a thought amongst the woodcock hunting crowd that woodcock are starting to run more when you approach them. And I've definitely seen some woodcock trying to scurry away. After the shot, if they are wounded, a lot of times if I have a woodcock that's wounded and it's still moving around, it'll actually be standing up with its tail flayed out in a more defensive posture, kind of acting tough, and
Hmm.
they're usually pretty easy to run down, but I've seen that quite a few times. But yeah, they're definitely a little, I mean, they're a small bird, they get knocked down pretty easily, so it's a
Mm-hmm.
little more rare to have cripples compared to pheasants who are just so tough.
Yeah. And doing the mixed bag, um, grouse and and woodcock together. I mean, there was a lot of hunts that I've done where you end up with some woodcock mixed in with the grouse. And I had a buddy that really liked woodcock, and I like grouse, so I'd trade him 2, 3 woodcock for grouse, and he was happy, I was happy. But I have eaten them. It's a different flavor. I even tried making like a pate out of it once, and that was interesting. Um, spread it on a cracker, cook the breast down, mince it up, add some uh, seasoning and mayo to it, and served it on a real dense bread, and that was kind of nice. Um, let's see, we got a no, don't have another question yet. Um, I always thought, you know, I guess I'm old, but didn't woodcock season open prior to grouse season in past years?
Yes, it used to open earlier with so rails and snipe opened September 1st, and
Right.
woodcock did open earlier and had a longer season and I think it was a 5 bird bag limit in the past. But
Okay.
the federal Fish and Wildlife Service controls that framework, and with the declining population, they did reduce the season to a 45-day and a 3 bag limit. And so now
Okay.
we, yeah, open typically with waterfowl opener, just depending on where we fall for that Saturday.
So for those uh, older hunters like myself that maybe remember it starting earlier, it did at one time, and now it's a little bit later in the year. Jim's got another question. When they flush, how high do they usually rise before flying horizontally? And is it better to shoot on the rise or wait until they transition to the horizontal flight?
Yeah, so it typically depends on how tall the vegetation is that you're hunting in. If it's shorter, they like to get to the top and then zoom out, which in taller, older forests, they won't go above the canopy necessarily, but kind of in that young stuff that's shorter, they'll get up out of the vegetation before taking off. I
Mm-hmm.
typically like to wait. I mean, sometimes, especially bigger females, for whatever reason, tend to get up and pause a little bit, like hover up there, and that's a good time to take
Mm-hmm.
the shot before they zoom off. Males, for some reason, they just tend to rock it out and good luck. But yeah, so it happens fast. So usually you're shooting as they're flying away. But if you can
Yep.
catch them when they make that pause, you got a nice, close, easy shot.
Uh, Jeff asked a question, have woodcock ever been raised in captivity?
Hmm. Not that I know of. I know a lot of people raise different grouse species, but I'm not sure that I've ever heard of woodcock being raised in captivity.
Steve wants to know, how do woodcock feed differently on worms versus above ground insects, etc.?
Yeah, so I think typically they're pulling these worms out of the ground by probing. And do they actually eat insects that are above ground? I'm guessing they probably would, but I've never actually seen that happen. So that's an interesting
In,
question.
in your presentation, you talked about them probably eating caterpillars. So that would be a food source of opportunity. I suppose if they were walking along and there was a caterpillar crawling there, they might grab onto one of
Yeah, I
those.
don't see why they wouldn't. And that end of their bill is quite flexible. It actually is a bit jointed where they can separate and move it in some interesting ways to grab a hold of an insect.
Wow. Uh, Jim offered a compliment. Very good seminar, Lindsey, with good info and actual hunting methods and identification tips. Thank you. So thank you, Jim, for that. Jeff came back with another question. Can Lindsey share what triggered her interest in natural resources, her career path, and how she ended up in her position for the DNR? for anyone interested in a career in natural resources?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was younger, I always enjoyed the outdoors and wildlife. It really was something I was interested in, but I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, not really in a too wild of an area, and somehow decided when I was in college that that wildlife could be a career. Had some examples of different projects in biology classes and ended up doing an internship at Seney National Wildlife Refuge in the UP of Michigan. And that internship, yeah, brought a lot of opportunities for grad school, went to Michigan Tech for grad school, and really dove into the forest habitat side of things. And from there, came back to that wildlife interest and started doing research for the Minnesota DNR. So it was really just getting out there and trying different things, taking those this internship that I really knew nothing about and just diving in and enjoying it and following the path when the opportunity arose. So I encourage anyone who's interested in natural resources to volunteer your time for the DNR, look for those internship opportunities, those entry level opportunities to get your foot in the door and try something new and see if you like it.
So in your cover slide there, it said Lindsey Shartell, PhD. What was your doctoral thesis on?
Yes, so actually my PhD was on exotic earthworms. And
Wow.
so I probably collected over 5,000 earthworms, IDing and measuring each one. We were looking at earthworm abundance in our national wildlife refuges in the Midwest. So the food of woodcock.
Yeah, yeah. Well, very good. If there's any questions, we're probably in the last few minutes of taking questions for this show. Oh, got one popping in. How do you exercise your high energy GSP, fellow GSP owner?
Yes, great question. No, we do a lot of scouting out in the woods, and we also get involved with some of the training organizations for bird dogs here in the Northwoods of Minnesota. We've got Northwoods NAVDA Club out of Reamer that I weekly go out and run dogs in the summer when we can't be in the woods. But in the spring and late summer, fall, of course, we're out there in the woods just scouting and hunting and looking for birds. So try to keep them busy.
As the parent to a 10-month-old, soon to be 11-month-old Springer Spaniel, I understand the importance of exercise. Because if he doesn't get it outside, he'll try to make up for it in the house. Jim wants to know, is your experience, Lindsey or Craig, do you have a dog? What are my chances of seeing birds if I just walk the hunter walking trails without a dog? In my experience, before I had a dog, I did a lot of brush busting, and I would put a hunter on the trail, and I would walk the thick stuff trying to flush birds, and hopefully they would fly across the trail for the other hunter, or just get lucky enough to put a bird up that I could shoot at. And I'm not, I've never shot a limit of grouse. I've shot 4 a couple of times. But it's hunting with the dog. It's just a whole different dynamic for me. It's like if you go out and get a grouse or a woodcock with your dog and watching how excited they become when they get on bird scent and putting the bird up and using a sub gauge gun like a 28 gauge, all the stars have to align to make all that work that day. And it's just one bird's a really good feeling. So what do you think, Lindsey?
Yeah, definitely a little tougher if you're walking the trails. You're more likely to have a rough grouse flush. Woodcock are, like I said, they hold pretty tight, so you almost have to step on one. But if you focus on hitting some of those openings and edges of wetlands, like a little area of standing water, kind of walk around the edge of it, you
Mm-hmm.
might have a good chance of getting a woodcock up and getting a shot at it. The other thing is when some of that migration is happening, you could be in an area where there's hundreds of woodcock, literally. And I've been out hunting where they're just flushing all over the place. And so if you get lucky, you can find one of those spots and time it just right. And yeah, you would not need a dog to shoot a limit of woodcock in that situation.
Well, I don't see any more questions popping in. Lindsey, I want to thank you for your time today and the wonderful presentation, and remind our audience that next week, episode 130 is going to be on sandhill cranes. And so that'll be an interesting program. Join our Linda Bylander as she interviews the folks from the wildlife management area on that. And if you got any questions on hunting, this is the time to start asking, because hunting season starts next week. So get in touch with
Saturday,
us.
rough grouse on
Yep.
Saturday. So
Yep. And then archery deer on Saturday. So it's the start of that time of year that we've all been waiting for, or a lot of us have been waiting for. So we got a couple more thank yous that came in, and Jim said he can't wait for Sandhill Cranes. So we'll be looking for you on that show. Thanks everyone. Cassie, if you could take us back to the